This video is intended to help you find a p-value from a t-test procedure using a t-table. The first step is, of course, doing any hypothesis test to calculate a t-test statistic. Then we find the associated degrees of freedom, which will be denoted as df. The degrees of freedom will be found depending on which type of test you're doing, whether you're doing a one sample t-test or if you're doing a two sample t-test. And it's important to note as we go through this video that if something is said as one sample, one-sided, or one-tailed, or two sample, two-sided, or two-tailed, these words can be used interchangeably. You can check out a video linked down in the description box below on how to determine which type of t-test to use based on the wording in a problem. But for this video, we are just going to focus on how to find both sides of the p-value. So after you find the corresponding degrees of freedom, you want to find your p-value. And you can do this by scrolling across the rows of your degrees of freedom, so all this stuff here in the middle. And then once you find your test statistic in the degree of freedom row that you want, you can find your p-value range in these rows right here. So for the one-tail or the one-sided, you will find your p-value in this first row, and then for the two-tailed, the two-sided, you can find your p-value in this second row right here. So let's take a look at our first example. We have a test statistic of 2.45 with 16 degrees of freedom, and we want to be able to find our one-sided p-value as well as our two-sided p-value. And the way we do that is we use our degrees of freedom, and we find that on our chart here, which is in this column right here, and we find that 16 degrees of freedom is right here. And so we're just going to highlight that. And then we're going to search this column, or row, excuse me. We're going to search this row right here to find our t-test statistic. And our t-test statistic, since it's 2.45, we try to find this in the highlighted row. Since the value is not in our row, we find where the range is that it'll fall between, and we see that it falls between 2.12 and 2.583. And so we go up this column right here and up this column right here in order to get our one-sided and two-sided p-values. So we look at the left side here. If you want to get our one tail, it'll be, our p-value will then be between 0.01 and 0.025. So to write that out, it'll look something like this: 0.01 p-value, and then 0.025. And then if you want to get your two-sided p-value, which is right here, you can see that it falls between 0.02 and 0.05. So 0.02 p-value, 0.05. Now let's take a look at another example. So we have a t-test statistic of -7.5 with 74 degrees of freedom. So when you have a negative t-test statistic, you just use the absolute value of it. So in this case, it'll just be 7.5. So let's figure out our one-sided and two-sided p-value. We do that again by finding our degrees of freedom on our table. And so we scroll all the way down and we see that 74 isn't exactly on our table here. It is between 60 and 80. So what happens when we don't find our degree of freedom on our table? We always round down our value or our degree of freedom, and this is because we want to have a more conservative estimate of our p-value. So 74 will then round down to 60. So we're going to use 60 for a degree of freedom on our chart. Highlight this row. And then we're going to try and find 7.5 in our row. And as you can see, looking through this row, you can't really find 7.5 because the last number is 3.46. And 7.5 is actually way off our chart. And when something like this happens, we use these values right here and say the p-value is less than these values here. So 7.5 is actually a pretty extreme test statistic, and when that happens, again, our p-value will be closer to 0. So if you want to find your one-tail or your one-sided p-value, which is right here, you basically just write it this way. P-value is less than 0.0005. And then for our two-tailed or two-sided p-value, we have it being less than 0.001. Now let's take a look at one more example. We have a t-test statistic of 0.78 and a degree of freedom of 6. So we find our degree of freedom first on our chart, which is 6, and then we highlight this to find our range for our test statistic. So let's go ahead and highlight the row for 6 degrees of freedom. And now we're going to find 0.78 on our chart. So you can see that 0.78 will fall between these two values of 0.718 and 0.906. And so we go up these columns to find our p-value range. So for one tail, we have our p-value between 0.2 and 0.25. And for two tail, we have our p-value between 0.4 and 0.5. And to write that out, it'll look something like this. 0.2 and then for a two-sided p-value, it'll be 0.40 to 0.5. And as you can see, the one-sided p-value and the two-sided p-value are just half of each other or double of each other. So if you want to make it easier for yourself, you can just find the one-sided p-value and then just double it. As you can see, 0.2 is just double it, 0.4, and then 0.25, double it, it's 0.5. And in the previous examples, it also applies the same way.